Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to InspireOne's sixth webinar for 2017 series on high potential leadership development. I am Varsha and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to a few things. In order to make this webinar a co-learning and sharing opportunity, we can use the text chat feature at all points during the webinar. For minimal disturbance, during the course of this webinar, we would request you to keep your lines on mute. There will be a dedicated Q&A session during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Hence, we encourage you to send us your questions as you have them. We will make up for those questions in the Q&A session. Our webinar today is from InspireOne. InspireOne offers leadership and organization development solutions to inspire business performance through transforming an organization's most valuable asset, their human capital. In past, InspireOne has successfully supported many businesses during business transformation through multiple solutions, and many of these have been in the leadership space. Our speakers today are Ms. Neeta Mohla and Mr. Gould. Ms. Neeta Mohla comes with about 3 decades of experience. Her expertise is in the area of leadership assessments and development, as well as emotional intelligence. Mr. Gould comes with a background involving training, operations, leadership development, sales, and consulting, spanning over 18 years. He has led several leadership initiatives in companies like Deutsche Bank, JSL, Mahindra and Mahindra Group, Unilever, and many others. The speakers today will be taking us through this webinar, through their experiences, and have a discussion on the same. Additionally, I would like to add, we have received an overwhelming response for this webinar over the last few weeks, and some of these responses have been from individuals from non-HR backgrounds. We appreciate the ownership displayed here by these participants for their own self-development, and we hope there are some takeaways for them from this webinar as well. With that, I would like to hand over to you, Neeta, to take us through the agenda for the day.
Thank you very much, Varsha, and good afternoon to everybody. It is my pleasure and privilege to be with you today, and I really look forward to sharing some of the insights that we've had around this subject and topic over the last many years. So as Varsha had mentioned, I'll start with sharing the agenda, the plan that we want to look at as to what we are going to cover today. This is divided in 4 sections. So in the first section, what we'll take up is the current state. We want to capture the current state of where leadership development is at. And we also want to look at some research findings as to what is it that is working. The second part of the plan is to cover 2 leadership case studies. These are contrasting organizations. So one is a traditional organization set up in a manufacturing setup. And we want to look at leadership development initiative that we ran there. And the second case study that we want to look at is leadership development initiative that we did in a new age media and entertainment company. So we want to look at these two experiences and see how were they similar, how did they contrast, what is the learning from them, etc. In the third section, then what we want to look at is looking ahead. What is it that we should all be aiming for? What will good look like? And finally, we have the last session, which is focused around questions and answers. So we'll begin with the first part of the agenda, which is capturing the current state of leadership development and looking at what is it that works. Now, this part of the section we have really based on a lot of research findings from different research organizations, and we'll take you through that along with what is it that we feel we have observed through our experience. So this is interesting, the current status of leadership. This is a survey that was done by Borderless Research in 2016, and what this shares is that 43% of the people who responded to this survey felt that leadership development is actually the main driver for ensuring delivery of business results, up to 43%, and also business growth. So leadership development for everybody, and everybody understands this, is really very critical. However, when we come to how does this pan out in terms of impact and effect, what we find is a little bit of a dismal result. because nearly half of the respondents feel that leadership development in their organization is executed in a poor way, and actually it is quite ineffective. So this is quite astounding. Added to this, another research also says that it is only 7% of the CEOs who believe that they are actually creating effective leaders. That means the leadership development initiatives are not creating results. 93% of CEOs feel so. And 56%, which is an overwhelming number, also believe that there is very little support from the top management when it comes to leadership development. So some of the key points that come out from this survey, which is actually looking at a business leadership development, which is a business of $50 billion worldwide, is actually giving very disappointing results. So what is emerging is that while everybody believes this is very important, it is definitely not being perceived as being effective. And could this be because organizations or corporates are still seeing leadership development as a low priority, nice to have initiative as opposed to a strategic initiative? Or is it because there is lack of seriousness, the mindset to really develop is not strong enough? Or is this an issue of implementation? Perhaps the answer lies in a little bit of all. So let's really go ahead and look at another research, which is then looking at what really creates success. So when leadership development has been successful in organizations, what is it that those organizations have done well? This is a McKinsey research that we're now, looking at. One of the key things here is that there is no one silver bullet which is going to create these results. And in fact, what McKinsey research says is that a number of actions are required. More than 40 actions are required in order for any leadership development initiative to be successful. However, it's obviously difficult for us to go through 40 such actions. So these actions primarily have been bucketed into 4 different areas. So let's look at those. The first bucket talks about the fact that there needs to be a shift on what, or there needs to be a lot of focus on what is it that we are trying to focus on. What does this really mean? It means that is the leadership development initiative contextualized and customized enough to an organization's strategy, to an organization's position, and to an organization's culture. And when this happens, when we have a very customized kind of a leadership initiative which is linked directly to business results and business impact, what is seen is that such an initiative is 8 times more likely to be successful. If we look at the second bucket, what we are saying is that are these initiatives just a one-off kind of an initiative which is disparate, which is disconnected, which is in small pockets, or is the organization looking at leadership development across the organization? And clearly, when leadership initiatives are done across the organizations with some common themes in mind, then these initiatives become very, very effective. This is a very important bucket that we need to really look at. The third bucket, or the third area of focus, which is also very important, is that to what extent is the training or the learning designed for making sure that post the input, there is enough focus on seeing that the output is getting embedded into the role set of the leaders. So by this we mean that is the focus only on the input, means what are the learning interventions that are being provided to the leader, or is the focus also on an entire integrated journey where there is support provided post these inputs are given to help participants or leaders integrate these learnings into their daily life. And again, when this happens, because this is extremely important, the whole learning initiative or the behaviors that the initiative purports to build are more sustained, are more sustainable, and the results therefore also follow. Finally, I think the last bucket, which is a mention that we made in the previous slide as well, is to what extent are the senior leaders in the organization, the top management particularly, engaged and involved in the leadership development process? So if it is only lip service and this is only being done at a level where it is agreed upon by, let's say, the top management, but ultimately becomes the responsibility of only, let's say, the L&D head or the OD head or the HR head or a project manager within that team, then for sure the impact and the effectiveness of such a learning initiative is not going to be high. Now, this is very, very critical for us to know that if we look at the actions, and of course, what I mentioned earlier, McKinsey is looking at 40 actions within these 4 buckets. But if there is enough focus on these 4 areas, and these areas are well integrated, which means it's not leadership initiative is not just an event, it's a proper process that is curated for an organization to build its leadership pipeline, then there are greater chances of effectiveness happening. Clearly, one of the things that is coming up in order for this process to work well, because obviously this process is, over a long period of time and is quite complex and has many elements to it, is the use and the role of technology. And that is becoming very, very important when we're looking at leadership development initiatives. In fact, in 2016, what research showed was up to 86% of people believe that blended learning solutions was the way forward. But if you're looking at the data that's coming in now, this has jumped to 100%. So everybody believes, in these surveys that blended learning and use of technology is going to become very, very critical going forward. So let's look at really the culmination of this research and really what are the key findings or the key themes that are emerging. Primarily, these are 2. The first one is personalized learning. So whether we're talking about ILT or we're talking about, individual assessments linked to development, individual journeys, etc. All this is still very relevant and very critical and very important. This hasn't gone away. But added to this is a lot of support and a lot of engagement which technology today can provide and must provide in any leadership development initiative. So of course we'll talk about this, we'll open this up a little later, but we just thought that we would summarize what we talked about from the earlier researches, that these are the 2 themes that any organization needs to keep in mind. Depending upon, of course, the organization, depending upon the culture of the organization, strategy, etc., the kind of learners, all of this. But is there enough focus on the personalized learning, the experience that the learner is going to go through for himself, and does the initiative also have enough of a focus around technology to both support and engage this process? The third key element, so we've talked about a leadership process, we've talked about the themes, but what we also need to look at is the learner himself or herself. And this is also very important because the expectation from a learner, so any leadership initiative is also dependent on the mindset of the learner. And when a learner's mindset especially focuses on 3 areas, one is adaptability to change, because clearly leadership development is happening because of VUCA environment, because of the changes that are coming upon all organizations today. So having that mindset to change, that adaptability to change is very critical from a learner's perspective. Second very important thing from a learner's perspective is the issue of self-awareness. So moving from denial to constantly reviewing themselves, introspecting, looking at what is it that they need to do differently, and also not forgetting what are their strengths and how can we use these strengths constantly in any role, in any complexity that we face. And the third aspect, which is becoming very critical from a learner's perspective, is really learning agility, which means that am I seeking more information? Am I looking at constantly learning new things for the role that I'm performing? Because even if I'm successful in my role, I should be aware that things are going to change and I need to constantly update myself. Now, Varsha had mentioned earlier that we have a large number of people attending this webinar who are not from the HR background necessarily, but perhaps looking at some inputs also for them in terms of their own development as leaders. So I especially want to make a few points to them, which is the following. The first thing, of course, is that it's great when a leader is accountable for their own development. That's when development happens. So I think that is something that is given. People who are attending this webinar are seeking more inputs for their own development, and that's great. That is the biggest starting point and most critical starting point. But leaders would do well to know that going forward, some of the behaviors that are going to become and competencies which are going to become really critical, in the future are things like strategic orientation or big picture thinking, or being able to look at the future, being able to look at what is it that we really need to change when we are adapting ourselves to larger, bigger, more strategic things. So strategic orientation. The second one is in the realm of what I would say influence and communication, because with stakeholders being multifarious and spread across, leaders will need to develop constantly their abilities to influence people and to communicate better. And the third area, which is going to be constantly coming under pressure for leaders, is how well are they able to develop their teams? How well are they able to create leadership pipelines so that there is this constant stream of talent available to an organization? So with these behaviors becoming very critical, leaders can look at what area do I really need to develop, and what can I take up first. I would also say that the best way of going forward is, first of all, to understand themselves, which means that in today's context, there are a lot of assessment tools available. There's a lot of feedback that can be sought from peers, from superiors, from subordinates. And the more open a person is to that, and the more flexible the person is to see themselves, both in terms of their strengths and in terms of their weaknesses, I think that building self-awareness and really introspecting will go a very, very long way in terms of leadership development. I think we talked about learning agility earlier on, and I think for any leadership development process to work well, leaders must seek constant information. And this information obviously has to be related to their work, but also general information which is related to the environment, to competition, is very, very important for leaders to build strategic orientation. So I would say that if there is one takeaway from leaders from this webinar, it is about how can I enhance and increase my ability to constantly search and research for information, and how can I then look into myself and see what are those areas that I need to develop, and create a good, robust plan to be able to develop on it. Finally, taking support from others, whether these are coaches, mentors, or maybe leaders who we can look up to and learn from them. So that can be really helpful, because behaviors can really be emulated by observing others and seeking feedback and also getting coached. So I would say that these are some tips that we can look at when we're looking at individuals who are wanting to develop themselves as leaders. Moving on, we talked about technology, and what we said was that technology seems to be gaining a lot of ground and a lot of popularity in leadership development and any learning initiative as such. And this slide we've just put up to show that whether an organization is a small organization with up to 50 employees, or an organization is a large organization with over 1,000 employees, all organizations today are looking at multiple ways of, providing learning experiences to leaders and to learners. And you can see the multiple, possibilities on the right-hand side. But essentially, what this slide is also talking about is every organization is looking at a variety of ways in which messages need to be given, in the way learning needs to happen. So in fact, I would like to just summarize and say, so today when we look at leadership development processes and leadership development journeys, this has become a real competence in itself. How can we create it? How can we curate it? How can we look at multiple avenues, multiple platforms that are available, and how can we create a good, sound, robust system, process, and an experience for the learner in order for results to happen? So that is really about what we want to talk about in this section. Let's look at now the second agenda item.
So, Neeta, I have a question here. Based on the kind of experience you have got, have you seen any changes in the kind of work you have done in India?
Right, sure. So, good question, because before we move on into the next part, I think what we're talking about so far, or what we have been talking about so far, is the way the research, which is global research, is looking at trends, is looking at the current need. So when we come to the India experience, we've been actually doing leadership development work, I think, since the early 2000 period and so on. And now if we look at in the last 14, 15 years, what has been the change? It's interesting to reflect upon that. Clearly, all organizations, and I hear when I say all, I'm making a statement, it's almost all organizations today are not looking at leadership as an event. They're definitely looking at leadership development as a process. And they may have different processes at different levels, but nevertheless, it's important. That focus is important. So clearly, what they are saying is that we just don't want that 10% of development, which is really a leadership development program. We want to understand what is the process, what is it that we'll do before, what is it that we'll do after, how will we measure success, how do we know that this is impacting business results. So those questions are definitely forthcoming. I wouldn't say that they are yet able to deploy it in a perfect way, but definitely they understand that, and most organizations want a process and not an event. I think that is clearly one of the changes that we have seen. I think the second big change that we have seen over the years is assessments are becoming very, very popular as a way of ensuring measures of success. I think assessments are becoming important from two perspectives. One, assessments allow the individual to look at their own profile and bring that forth, bring that data point forth in any development process. So it's not generic anymore. It is I as a person am good in this areas, not good in this areas. So really from this process, I will take areas or those parts that are critical to me for my role and my profile. And I think that's becoming almost mandatory for most of the development initiatives, and that's really good news. What is also interesting, and I think this is also something that makes us feel very positive, is that the appetite for looking at technology definitely is increasing, is improving. In fact, what research globally is saying is that 86% of the people a year back looked at blended solutions as a way of developing leadership. Today it is 100%. So there's a big surge in people who are wanting blended solutions, and especially technology going forward. And I would really look at these three trends that are working well in India as organizations look at leadership development. I'd also like to ask Craig for his experience. So, Craig, is there something that you would like to also add?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a couple of thoughts. I thought I'll just add a little bit of detail on some of, just for our listeners to understand that a little better. For instance, when you're speaking about process and not an event, so we're not, one of the changes is that we are not looking at it as just a one-day intervention or a two-day intervention. And it's currently a change, which means there are still some organizations that do that, but then they don't get a lot of benefit. But the trend is moving away from that. And what that means in terms of skills for anyone in the learning organization is to start doing more of project management, is to start, and then there are going to be now multiple processes that happen over time that will enable us to move into this new area, because it's not just that event, it's things we do before, it's things we do after. Especially a lot will happen after to ensure that learning sticks, that it becomes sustainable, etc. So that's on the process, that's on the project management. On the assessments, we're seeing a lot of interest in in different types of assessments. Traditionally, there was a lot of psychometric personality type of assessments, but there's also now behavioral assessments, different ways to assess behavior. There are also assessments around perception, perception of manager, perception of peers, etc. So there is, all of these things happening, and organizations that do it well make best use, of these trends and incorporate them into their process.
So great. Thank you very much. I think moving on in the agenda, we want to spend maximum time here on this section of what we want to present. And what we want to really share here are two case studies looking at leadership development initiatives. The first is, of course, a leadership development initiative which is set in a very traditional kind of an organization, typically a manufacturing setup. And the second is really sharing a leadership development initiative in a new age company. Here we are taking the example of a company that we worked in, which was in the space of media and entertainment. And really what we want to do is look at how. So what we've talked about first is leadership development needs to be contextualized, needs to be customized. So how was this done and how is it really different? So Craig, I would like to invite you to share the first case study, which is the leadership development in a traditional manufacturing company.
Right. So I'd like to, just refer back to one of the slides. I thought that was a very, good kind of overview and checklist where we had the catalyst for success of leadership development, those 4 points. And this is an example where we have used them. And this is for a large steel conglomerate. And what we were able to do for them is at a senior level to begin to align the needs. So part of what we are saying, if you remember that earlier slide, is that we should be focusing on behaviors that matter the most. And so in this case, how do we find those behaviors that matter the most? Of course, we do a gap analysis, various kinds of a pre-diagnostic assessments, etc. But we really needed to find out what are the pain areas of the organization that are strategic in nature. So which means we identify behaviors and then we begin to connect them with pain areas as we work through the application of the program. So we already needed to start thinking about what's going to happen after the program, how is it going to be used, and what is the impact it's going to have on the organization. Which means in this case, a lot of our conversations happened with the senior leadership team to understand and align with what is most critical for them, and begin to identify pain areas that the organization is facing, and then have leaders through the action learning projects that they would take up, and which is really the sustainability part of the initiative, where they'd implement the behaviors they learn. That implementation would have to be aligned with addressing these needs. And what that ends up doing is brings a lot of buy-in and focus from senior leadership team as well, because we are solving real problems and problems that begin to affect them. So what they wanted to focus on in this case was strategic orientation and inspirational leadership. And it was a 6-month long journey with multiple phases. And of course, there's time we spend in pre-work, there's time spent understanding context. I think it's very, very important as part of the process to really understand the current context. Where are we? Where do we want to go? A lot of what we do then needs to start aligning with that context. Without context, any development, it's difficult to show clear ROI if the context is not clear. And so we take those inputs from phase one, which is the diagnostic, and then we start to build that into the intervention itself. And again, just like we mentioned on the earlier slide, what works best is when it's a journey. Because there's a few things that can happen as part of a journey. It means I can address A, B, C in terms of behavior. I can stitch them together with a project that happens in the background. I can assign ownership as a mentor to coaches within the organization, senior leaders, which also goes back to one of the 4 points we mentioned earlier. And so you see, as we um, build this journey, we're keeping those key principles in mind because that's what enables us to have success. And so, for instance, when the coaching would happen, we'd involve the senior leaders at a CXO level, who were then, through our process, assigned as coaches and mentors for projects that participants were assigned to work on during the implementation phase. And because there was a senior leader also involved, one is he had a bit of a responsibility because he was mentoring, but he also had visibility as a result of that process. And so could not only give his input, but it could also add pressure to push these interventions along. So sometimes it's just learning that's doing all the driving. The participant may be attempting, but his manager has a different priority. So when you start to get them all aligned and align the leadership priorities as well, then it really works well. And then if we look at the output, so maybe one of the things that we can talk about is, because it was traditional, the way we did things would also be impacted. For instance, in a traditional setup, we'd spend a little more time in the workshops. We'd be very conscious of hierarchy. The methods we'd use would be a little more traditional. For instance, we wouldn't be able to use a lot of manufacturing. Everyone is in a factory and may not be as exposed to, let's say, micro learning or exposed to using an app too much. So in this instance, we used traditional methods. We spent a lot of time focusing on the skill. We did it in a method that was comfortable and allowed them this and then come back, implement. Even the implementation for the project, we gave them enough time, and we built into our process a lot of follow-up to ensure that those conversations happen, that enables them to keep moving along and achieving those goals that they set out to achieve. And with all this effort, and again, as you can see, there's a lot of effort required. There is a lot of project management. There is a lot of coordination, and that gives you a sense of from you and your team to make these things successful. So the outcome for this particular intervention that we ran is that more than 50% of participants showed a substantial improvement. And this was again in those specific behaviors that the company thought were needed, right? So for instance, strategic thinking. They wanted their leaders to start stepping up more and start coming up with solutions that others had not yet thought of, rather than just come with a problem. While this is a bit of a cliche to say, come to me with a solution and not with a problem, but what we can come up with a solution point, and eventually they hit a brick wall, and then they go to their manager. It changes the way they would think about these things and broadens their view. It's a very deep behavior, broadens their view. So we focused on building that, and as a result, we saw the participants start to think really, really differently, to do a lot of benchmarking, a lot of best practice they would find out, and brought a lot of those benefits to the company as a result. And we could see that directly in their projects, the output of the projects, quite exciting. Additionally, we could see there was a lot of collaboration, communication became better. They were really able to inspire and influence others to go along, with some of their projects and that they were driving. So Neeta, I know we both worked on this together. Is there anything else you feel that came out of this journey?
No, I think you've covered it well, Craig. I think it would be useful, for our participants today to also understand that, it's not just this company, but if we look at other organizations who are also, in a similar context, so organizations which are a little bit more process driven, have so to say, a little bit of the older generation and so on and so forth, and older processes, if set up in manufacturing organizations or even FMCG. So, are there some common themes that we see that run across these organizations from a perspective of the requirements for leadership development or the successes that we have seen in similar old age industries? So would you like to give your your experience of that, and then I can also keep adding as I remember this.
Yes, so I think some of the things we mentioned earlier is to really align with what's most important to the business. Something that's very critical. It's not something that it's not a battle that the learning team can fight and win. Many times I know learning teams are very passionate about behavior. They're passionate about developing the organization, but that passion may not translate to get enough buy-in and get the leadership team to want it as much as us. So getting them to see the benefit, just what will change and what impact that will have on the results. Getting that buy-in is critical to moving these things along.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that especially when we are looking at traditional industries, I think one aspect of leadership development which is very critical is how we link it to the culture of the organization. So, for example, all the things that you talked about, that here we had to take into account hierarchy. So similarly, when we work with other organizations, we've had to take into account the change that they're going through. So another similar organization where the products and their employees when they looked at the future, they realized that 40% of this is going to change. The profile is going to change to more, Gen Y type of people. And how do we bring about the change in leadership development or the leadership approach in that particular organization? Again, we had to look at that particular context and that reality, and from there really build the leadership initiative to ensure that it meets that objective. So contextualization, of course, is very, very critical. I think what is also very important is to see what is the change that the organization is trying to drive, and how is that change going to be accepted right when we run the process, right, with the participants, with their supervisors. And typically in old age organizations, unless we bring in the supervisor, we bring in the next level of leadership to really look at what is it that's happening, a very little movement will happen, because they are used to existing processes, they're working well. So any change, unless the top leaders get involved, it becomes very difficult to drive that. So I think that these are some of the points that I have also seen in the work that we've done with more traditional organizations, and the needs that they have and the effectiveness that can happen if we focus on the right elements. Moving on, we'll also take the case of leadership development in a media company. And this is completely, in contrast to what we've discussed so far. So if I look at this particular organization, really the talent was very young. So the change was not that they were looking at Gen Y. The change was there was Gen Y, and the whole organization had to align to that culture and that way of really thinking in order for them to achieve their goals. So you can imagine the participants in this case were young, global kind of leaders, very, very mobile. That's one of the issues of organizations, that these people are extremely mobile, very proud of their own specific skill set, and really looking at challenge and change all the time. So this is the profile of the participants. In fact, it was also, so we sort of named it more as a young leadership development initiative. We did young leaders was what we really called it. The challenge that this organization had, and I'm sure that everyone can relate to it, that being in the media and entertainment company, they were looking at innovation as a major way of achieving their goals. They had to be innovative all the time. And also, when you look at innovation, typically what you're looking at is creative people not being able to work very effectively in teams. So how do you bring about innovation while working in teams? So that was a big, big challenge. And also the other challenge was, great. They've got great skills when it comes to their, and competence when it comes to their own specific areas, which are, which are part of their role. But they don't believe in building people, developing their teams. They are individual, very individualistic actually in their approach. And however, from an organization standpoint, unless they are developing their people, again, there are these traditional issues of a very high turnover. A new organization, actually, the face of the organization is new every 1.5 years. And so it cannot sustain and develop roots. So that was the overall challenge, that we do want innovation, but we do want these people to act as leaders, and we do want them to be able to collaborate better. So innovate while collaborating better. So like we discussed in the earlier case, here the challenge was what methodology. Now we've understood that this is the requirement, this is the business need. We've also understood the profile of the people and how is it that they're going to learn. So what methodologies, or what is the way that we are going to really curate this learning experience for these people? And here the journey was spread over. So, in the earlier case, if it was a little shorter, here the timeline was really expanded. So it was a year. In fact, even it sort of went beyond a year, because these people learned with shorter interventions, with briefer interventions, but multiple interventions and multiple ways of really addressing the same issue. So taking that into account, this journey was spread out, more spread out. Of course, what it had to incorporate or make sure, the experience was that of a high level of fun and engagement, because that was the profile of the people. They can't sit in one place and think too much what they need, and not too much of, conceptual input. It needed to be a lot more fun, a lot more engaging, a lot more output related, and that was perfect actually for us. A lot of variety. So introduce the same concept, take it through a number of different, different routes to reinforce. Look at technology as a very strong binding force, and that is what we really did in this particular intervention. And make everything look very visual, young and fresh. So some of these we took from their values, and some of this we took from the way we saw them operate. So the look feel of the entire intervention had to be young, had to look fresh, had to look like something which was very contemporary. In fact, the way we looked at this journey and the way we finally put it all together was to really take the theme, from a movie, and look at all these people being actors creating a movie together, and create that theme as an experience that they were really going through, which worked extremely well. One of the things that worked very well in this, which was something that we put in a lot of effort towards, is how can we get them to innovate in a team? And what happened in this was, something that as an output and outcome became such a high that this sort of fed into the engagement, back into this 24-month process. So what we did was, this entire team, we created, let's say, a team of 10, 15 people from different functions with different skills, and we gave them a very challenging business problem, which was a real problem for this company to solve. And when they put on their creative, and we said what we're looking for is a creative issue, a creative solution. So please don't come up with things which are, just incrementally different. Think completely outside the box. So that was a challenge which was thrown to them. Since it was real, they could see the impact of it and they could see how this could be very useful to the organization. What we also did was, and we realized that for these people, what would make it very exciting is that if we can make this output very visible in the organization. So this output was to be presented to no less than the CEO of the organization. And the CEO of the organization, we engaged the CEO of the organization in this process right from the beginning. So there was a little bit of input from the CEO in the beginning of what is the expectation and so on and so forth. Now, the output of this, when the team got together and really worked well, was so successful, was so energizing, was so, exhilarating that when they actually presented it and the CEO was really excited about this and the CEO wanted to implement it, this became a big, big force for us to drive the initiative for the rest of the time and the rest of the process going forward. So for us, the success was really that it's a long process. We have to ensure that there are quick successes that we are constantly helping these people to come up with, because that is what will engage them in the process long term. How is it that we're going to make it very visible? Here we knew the visibility has to be with the person absolutely at the top. It was lucky for us that we got that engagement. It was lucky for us that there was a good output that was created pretty much in the first few months of this process, because then that created the whole momentum going forward, and they wanted to solve more problems, they wanted to work together much more, and that was precisely the behaviors that we were trying to get them to build. So in this process, I think these were some of the things that worked very well, and I must say that it was a very exhilarating thing for all of us. And what we did very effectively was, at the end of the 24 months, we created a strong, I would say it was like a collateral, it was like a coffee table collateral, a big booklet where everybody's successes and the team's successes and this entire journey was captured in the theme of a movie. And of course, people felt very excited that they were featured in this. This was something that was, a great collateral, something that's going to remain with the organization for a long period of time, something that can be shown to the others and, will be a big pull factor. And they were kind of, the leaders in this process. So all of this, the emotional part, the technology part, the part which was to do with behaviors, came together very well for us for this particular organization. And that's how we created success. And really the success was that the people who were selected for this process, each and every person really got certified. So we ensured 100% success for these leaders, and that was very extremely helpful to us. So that is the second case study that really we would like to talk about.
So, Neeta, if you don't mind, I do have a question here. How was this different from a traditional case?
Right. I think that, when we are looking at the first case example and the second case example, I hope that we've been able to bring out that in the first case example, again, basically it boils down to how you are linking your leadership objectives to their strategy and also to the culture of the organization. So one important differentiation is that the cultures are very different, and taking from the cultures, the processes that they use and what creates success are very, very different. So for a person who's in a new age kind of an organization, if we look at things which are very, very conceptual or very, very informative or very, very process driven, it kind of bores them. So we have to really engage them with something which is shorter, something which is, use other routes to really, get the same learning through. So that's one. I think we're looking at the context being very different. We're looking at the culture being very different. We're also looking at the profile of the learners being very different. We're also looking at the fact that possibly in the first instance, too much use of technology may not be very successful. But in the second case, a lot of technology support may actually work very well. In the first instance, when we're talking about how do we engage with the senior leadership, the immediate supervisor becomes very, very critical because it's a hierarchical structure. Whereas in the new age organization, because these structures are more flat, can we get the visible leaders or the top leaders engaged in this process earlier on? And usually they're more willing to do that as well, especially in startups. So that really is something that we can use, the energy of a startup to ensure that we are being able to bring in a different methodology and a different process. So by and large, these are the differences. I don't know, Craig, if you would like to add to this in any way.
So let's then move on to the next section. We would be looking at what good looks like now. Neeta, would you like to take us?
Sure. I think that, we've discussed a lot about what is it that we've done. We've discussed a lot about what is it that, research is really throwing up. But, we are all looking at what is it that we can do to improve? What is it that we can do to make things better? And therefore, I think this section, what we want to look at really is what will good look like in the medium term and in the long term. And I would like to take us through this process to really bring about this section. Right. So as you can see here, what we've brought together is that a little bit about there are different parts to this process, and in each part, what is it that becomes very relevant? We're also referring back to that earlier slide where we said that the 4 areas of intervention become very, very critical. And really, if we have to look at what actions do we need to take in those 4 areas, maybe this slide sort of enumerates that a little bit more. So the first part of it is, of course, understanding the culture of the organization, understanding the structure of the organization, understanding really how processes in the organizations work, because this is also a leadership process. So we need to really understand how do processes work and use the understanding to drive this process as well, which is really getting to understand the organization insights. That is from an organization perspective. One very critical part of learning is getting the learner engaged. And that's where individual assessments, typically looking at what does the person do well. Within the role, what is it that success looks like, and how can we use the individual strengths to be more successful? And that's where the individual assessments become very important. And the more we are able to connect the goals of this intervention to the individual's strengths and the individual's area of development, and they see that how does it link to the results that are expected from their role, that's what really becomes important, and that's what really creates success. Here, typically when we look at individual assessments and we create the individual development plan, what is very important is the buy-in of their supervisor. So of course we have supervisory alignment later on, but is there a clarity? Is there a three-way understanding that is between the learner and the supervisor and the person who's helping this whole process? That why is it that these goals are going to be important? Are these goals commonly accepted by these three parties that are critical for the learning process? And do we have a clear action plan as to how this is going to really proceed? That's the important step. I think the entire pre-engagement is very important because it's not just as any process, any change process, it's not just about defining the process, it is about engaging the person in the process. So how do we help each person to see how this process is going to help them in the leadership development journey is very critical. And here the pre-engagement, how do we plan the communication, how do we plan the R&R around it, how do we make sure that people are excited to go through this journey becomes an important step. And this is not an important step at this time alone, it is right through, but we're just calling out that this is an important part of the process. We've talked about the fact that the help that the top management gives in this, and the supervisor engages, the extent to which the supervisor engages in this process really lends to the effectiveness of this process. So how do we manage this? Because it's not easy. We find that there are a lot of issues that we encounter over there. So how do we manage this process? How do we get them engaged? How do we get them involved is extremely critical. Usually, most of the development focuses on the 70-20-10, but what we are saying is that all these different aspects are equally important. So, of course, the 70-20-10, which is how do we ensure that learning is happening on the role set? How do we ensure that they're taking real life situations to solve business issues? How do we make sure that these situations are critical to the organization so that there is engagement of everybody? How do we also support them through other processes of feedback or coaching is very critical. And of course, how do we ensure that the right learning input is being given to them at the right time? So that's the learning sessions, and how do we make this experience using technology, using multiple platforms that are available to us today to make the learning multifarious and very engaging. And finally, the last bit, which is a lot that the organizations and us as consultants can do better in, is really the integration. So usually there's a lot of energy that happens in the input, like we talked about earlier, but really the support that happens post the input is given to ensure that integration is happening well becomes very, very critical. And do we have all processes in place to ensure that we are measuring the success, we are supporting people to apply the new learnings in the new area. We are doing this in multiple phases during this entire process. All this has become will become very important to ensure that the journeys and the interventions that we are looking at going ahead become more effective and give more results than what they're giving today. And we can hardly minimize the fact that the use of technology right through this process is going to become more and more critical. We've given certain examples in this slide of where technology can be applied, but it is really up to the organization. There are multiple things that are available in today's context, but we will definitely advise that use technology right through this process. It's efficient, it ensures sustainability, it's also more cost effective, and organizations need to look at what is it that will work in their context. Craig, would you like to add to anything in this?
So very robust, I think, for all our listeners. We can see that this is a great process to keep in mind. It really helps us see, how much needs to happen before. Traditionally, we would maybe just do a TNI analysis in an organization once a year. From that TNI, we figure out some gaps, and from those gaps, we then identify some workshops. Then we identify vendors for those workshops and deliver them. And that ends it, and then we go through the whole process the next year. So this is quite a different, very robust method. This method will definitely bring results. It'll make learning partners, it'll make the learning department the hero, because it'll really let us genuinely address the needs of the business. It'll help the business actually to see the results. And obviously, then they come back to us with increased confidence with more real problems as they move forward, because they've seen, just how our solutions work. So I think it's a very robust, strong process, which should be of great value to everyone listening in.
Yeah. So, Craig, I really like the point that you made that a process is fine, but I think the end objective of a process is to address the issues of the customer. And here in this case, of course, the customer is also the participant leader who's going through this process. And when the leader comes out of this feeling very confident or more confident, we know that this process has worked well. So it is really while we can, look at multiple levels of how do we measure success, I think one measure of success, which is very critical, is how confident are the leaders going through this process of applying whatever learning that they've got from this process in their real situation. How motivated are they to really apply this? And if we've got that right, we know that the process is working.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Neeta, for taking us through all your experiences. especially the two cases, and showing us what the two extremes can look like and what the ideal situation can also look like. While you've been talking, we've been getting a lot of questions. Let's start with the first one. This is addressed to you, Craig. Can this process be totally outsourced, the L&D process? The entire leadership assessment process, can it be outsourced?
Yes, so I'm just got a sense of the time. I think we're running out of time, but let me answer that quickly. Yes and no. So yes, I think it can be outsourced, especially the design, right? At first look, the whole design of it could be quite different from what we are used to, from what we may have learned in the past. So definitely the design. I think what the rest of it, though, there needs to be a lot of partnership. There's a lot of buy-in that needs to happen internally. There's a lot of conversations that need to happen, which can't be driven from someone outside the organization. So there is a lot of hand-holding, and it's not just, again, between a vendor and the learning partner. We have to get business also involved. We have to get the business leaders themselves involved. And so then there are at least 3 or 4 key entities. There's the partner, there's the learning team, there's the leadership of the business teams, and then there's participants themselves and their supervisors. So there's all these moving pieces that it's very critical to get aligned. So yes, it can be outsourced, but there's still going to be, which is a good news, yes, it can be outsourced, but there's still going to be a lot of effort required. We shouldn't feel that if we ask a vendor, a partner to do this, that we can just sit back and watch it unfold. There will still be a lot of effort to make this successful.
I agree with you, Craig. There is a level of ownership and accountability that comes with the organization. The next question I'd like to address to you, Neeta. What is your experience with technology?
Right. So I'm assuming that the question means that, have we used technology in these leadership development interventions and what are the kind of results that we've seen? Because we talked about especially the second case study where a lot of technology was used. So thank you for that question. And so I'll just share the experience that we have. So of course, we use technology for a number of things. We use technology for assessments. We use technology for looking at the 70%, which is how people take on projects and how they are running the process through taking on these projects. We also use technology. For example, we have a mobile app where we use technology there to ensure that there is learning which is happening beyond just the classroom and at their own time, at the participants' own time. And we also use technology, which is something new that we've added, which is artificial intelligence, the IBM Watson technology, to also give feedback to our participants on the behaviors that they are using. Now, I think we've got some mixed results, but the good news is that most of this result has been very positive. When it is used in the right way with the right audience, we get fantastic results. Now, typically, if we use too much of technology with people who are not very conversant with technology, clearly we have to, push them too hard and the purpose is defeated. But when we've used technology in the right way, we've got great results. In fact, when I talk about the app, we have an app called Mastro. And when we've used it with organizations, whether these have been banks or insurance organizations or even traditional organizations, recently we've used this for. The utilization of this app and engagement, one way in which we measure success, has been way above 75%, which I think is fantastic, which means 75% of the people are using the app in this case very effectively. They are clearing the micro skills because the utilization is over a period of time. They have to complete several micro skills during this process. And the results are over 75%, which I think is really, really great. We've also got results like one of the organizations have looked at the linkage of utilization of this with business results. So, for example, productivity in a particular branch of a bank, and it's a great correlation. So if I read out the figures, it will sound really, phenomenal to our participants. But the fact is that this is the company itself sort of making that linkage and saying that, it is really great. When we've looked at the artificial intelligence, technology that we've used in a lot of leadership intervention to give feedback to people on what are the behaviors that they are using, people have generally come back to us and said that the experience has been really great. So the situations and scenarios have been very close to the challenges that they face. And when they get the result of this, they are able to see and make a correlation between what is it that they do and what is it that they don't do, which is, I think, great news for us, because this is still in its nascent stage, but we're getting very good results from this. Typically, where we have to drive engagement in technology is more when we are asking them to give a lot of inputs over a period of time through on the projects that they have taken. So clearly, that's where we need the engagement of the organization and the review by supervisors to help us, drive that. But otherwise, I would say that we're getting great results, very promising results. And I think from the last year to this year, we've seen a very good trend with the leaders when we've used technology. They've really reported it themselves as well, and so have the organizations. So I hope that's a short answer to the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Neeta. We are running short of time now, so we'll be able to only take one more question. We do invite more questions. We would be answering them offline. Let me keep this as an open question, both for you, Neeta and Craig. In India, do we really get the top management support when it comes to such initiatives? Craig, would you like to start? I think we may be having some technical problem here. Maybe we can have Neeta, you start, and we can have Craig's inputs later.
Right. I think this has been a big challenge, and there are times when we have been able to overcome this challenge, and clearly it has had a huge impact on the effectiveness of the intervention. So I'll take one real case study. So in this case, this was a large insurance firm looking at developing their mid senior leaders. In this case, the CEO was extremely cooperative. In fact, the CEO himself saw this as a real strategic imperative for him, and therefore included leadership reviews in all his leadership reviews, included reviewing how this process is going. And since this was happening at the very highest level, so every time the CEO would say, what's happening on this intervention, where are we at, what is it that we needed to achieve, where is it that we are at versus those goals, and etc. Down the line, we saw phenomenal results, because this was happening at his level. So down the line, the next level was taking it on, because they had to sort of report this. And so it was really sort of percolating down the levels. Conversely, we've also seen where this process has been totally handed down to, let's say, a project manager in an L&D function. And clearly, the person really, with the best of intentions, really struggles, because as Craig mentioned earlier, it is important to get the business person engaged. It is important to get the supervisor engaged. And when this is not happening, then very quickly, this is a process where people lose interest. So halfway down, there are some people who still take this on because they are interested in their own development, but we find that the percentages really drop after this initial start and this initial hype. So it is a big challenge, and I'm hoping that going forward, the leadership will also recognize this as not something nice to do, but something absolutely very, very critical to do. And if that can happen, I think the way forward will become easier for everybody concerned.
Thank you, Neeta, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope this session has been especially fruitful for all of us. Thank you so much.